I'm recording. All right. Good morning, everyone. This is a Tuesday morning, which means it's time for Tuesday Training and Tactics here in the Paradise Valley Realty One Group office. You need to move that. Come adjust that if you need to.
No, it's good.
Okay.
It's good.
All right. So I have had a lot of questions because many of you do also do residential rentals or leases for your clients. Just a reminder, Realty One Group does not do property management. So hopefully you understand the difference. We'll get to some of that here in just a minute. But let me go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about the new forms. So there are a variety of different leasing forms. I'm not talking commercial here. We're just going to be talking about residential and some miscellaneous forms that were adopted in August of 2024. Two new forms were created, but it is really important you recognize they are unrelated to the NAR settlement, okay? And again, people online, if you want to jump in, please. We've got a small crowd here because Title is not here. Title doesn't deal with our leases, so I gave them the morning off and said, no, you don't need to come spend an hour with us. While I love Rock Title being here, they have plenty of work to do with the escrows and stuff. So does anyone know why leases are not a part of the NAR settlement? Anybody want to give a guess? Anybody online? All right, so the reason is because it was very specific to buyers and sellers. So because of that, there was no reference to either commercial or leases, residential or rentals, or commercial anything or land, okay? So the reason they redid and created a couple of new forms is because in the past, many of our forms doubled for both residential leases and purchases. So we couldn't have them using the old form because otherwise people would try to use that for sales. So two of the new forms that were created was a tenant broker exclusive employment agreement. That is a brand new agreement. Notice it says tenant broker and not buyer broker. So if you are working with a tenant, please use this form and we will go over why that's so important. The second form that was created is a form called Notice to Tenant of New Management. And that is very important if you are helping a landlord. Now, again, you can assist a landlord in renting a property out. You can do the lease. You just cannot do the property management. So if for some reason your landlord switches from one property manager to another, most likely they're going to have them do this form, but I'm going to show you what the form is. We're not going to go into detail on it, but I will show it to you. In addition to forms that were, of course, revised, are the property management agreement, and that was an AAR form, so they had to revise that. And funny thing, look, a form we all know and love because it's where we start most of our transactions, is the real estate agency and disclosure election, the READY form. All right, so let's go to the tenant broker exclusive employment agreement. And we're going to do this today very similar to what we did when we went over all of the different changes. I'm going to show you every line of this agreement and explain what this agreement does, because this is really critical if you're working with a tenant, okay? All right, so very easy tenant broker exclusive employment agreement. Very similar to any of the other revisions you've seen or our standard forms. You have the two parties that are involved, and again, this was updated on August of 2024. You have the tenant and the broker, because guess what? This is between you as a representative for Realty One Group, right? The broker is Realty One Group, but you are the agent, and the tenant. And what is one of the critical things that you must have on any contract, folks? What is it that you have to have on any contract? The term. The start and the end date must have both of those on there. That's at the very top of this. Please understand you do need to write your broker company, meaning Realty One Group, on that firm name. You can put Realty One Group 08 if you want to reference Paradise Valley's office, that's fine. And then your agent name below. All right. So the next is that this talks about the employment. right? So you are basically asking or being asked to help the tenant find a property. And unfortunately, we're having trouble here. Our little guy is kind of in the way. Okay. Locate property to rent or lease, meeting the following general description. What does this look like? This looks just like your buyer broker exclusive employment agreement, right? Are you doing residential? Are you doing land, commercial, or other? When might you use the word other in there? Any guesses? And please, people online, you can open your mics. Okay, everybody's gonna be quiet today. Let's see if I can get my other slide. When might you use the word other? And I'll go back up. You can negotiate. Obvious 10 says negotiate at tenant's direction to obtain acceptable terms and conditions. Yes, in fact, folks, when you are actually working for a tenant, you are supposed to help them go through that contract. Even if you don't end up filling in the lease, oftentimes the landlord fills out the lease, but you should be going through that with them. So guess what? If you have never worked with a tenant and you have never looked at the residential lease agreement, then you probably should spend some time and read that so you understand what it says. And then you're to assist the tenant during the transaction within the scope of your expertise in licensing. Now, let's go back to why I asked, what could you write on the line other?
Melissa,
Yes.
I always went to residential, so now I'm wondering like what that other is.
Well, you
I'm
still
gonna read.
you probably want to check the the box residential, but a lot of people have asked in terms of the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement, and they keep asking me, well, we just want that single one property thing, and we want to go to the buyer broker show property form. And I'm like, no. You use the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement, and on the line other, you put that one address, right? So same thing. If you've got a tenant that says, hey, look, all I want you to do is show me one property. I want to go look at this property. Let's say at the Point, Tapatio down at 7th Street. I want to go see one rental property. It's this cool home. I think it's awesome. I think it's perfect for me. I don't want to waste your time. Great, fine. I'm going to fill out that one address. Then go off if that's you want to go look on any other online apartments.com, homes.com, wherever they're going to look for rentals, that's fine. They don't want to include me, but this one they do. Then on that other, you can write that address. Same thing with the buyer broker exclusive employment agreement. If they're only asking you to show one property, please don't use the showing property buyer broker, agreement to show property, because guess what? They talk to some other realtor a week later and decide they're going to have Joe write that purchase contract for them. Guess what you get? You get nothing if you use that show property form, right? Because that's not exclusive. They can swipe right, keep swiping, go find somebody else. You're done, right? I don't know whether it's swipe right or left, sorry. But at any rate, the point is, if you're looking to do something for one property, or maybe you write two properties in there, that's fine. The other thing is, I do recommend you fill in the geographical area. Now, this is a catch-22. I caution you, don't put down Scottsdale, because guess what? If they rent in Phoenix, you don't get paid, right? They're not obligated to pay you. They went off and found something, they dealt with it. But look, my employment agreement said it was Scottsdale. I rented in Tempe. Sorry. Okay. So I would be a little more broad based on that. That's up to you. It's how you do your business. You do your business your way. We'll support you. But please don't come crying to me when somebody doesn't pay you and we go back and look, because the first thing I'm going to pull up when you call me and say, hey, somebody went and got a deal with somebody else, I'm going to go look at what your employment agreement was. Okay. So there you go. Put a specific address right there on the other. All right. The other thing is the geographical area. I highly recommend you put down a larger area than you anticipate, right? That person that says, oh, I'm not going to look on the west side. So you just put Phoenix, Scottsdale, and then they lease in Surprise. You're like, what about me?
Maricopa County.
Or yeah, Maricopa County, you can put Maricopa and Pinal County to cover the city of Maricopa, right? That's up to you. But I would at least put something broader than one city. I would not do just one city. Okay, so agency relationship. Guess what, folks? When you're working with a tenant, you still have to use the ready form, right? So any guesses what would be the first two documents with, well, actually there are three. First three documents you would use with a tenant, almost identical to what you use with a buyer, would be what? Any guesses? Somebody online? I
The
can't.
tenant, and then the ready.
So this tenant what? The tenant
The
exclusive?
tenant buyer broker exclusive, and then the ready.
The ready. And what would be the third one that you could use? Very similar to buyer broker, but what, or the buyer side, what would you use the other form?
ABA.
Actually, we don't need the ABA because none of those affiliations affect a lease, right? We don't use title, we don't use lending, we don't use home warranties, so you really don't need the ABA. But what's the fourth document you use with a buyer?
Wouldn't that be a tenant advisory?
A tenant advisory. There's a buyer advisory, there's a tenant advisory. So why not get those out of the way? Send on to your client the tenant advisory. So you've got those three already done and you can put them in when you first meet with your tenant. All right. So the ready form was already one of those. Then we're going to go look at the lines 15 through 20. It talks about due diligence, right? Once an acceptable property is located, tenant agrees to act in good faith to lease the property and conduct inspections, investigations of the property that tenant deems material important. Now, you know what? This is tough, and the bottom note is the same note we have in the buyer stuff. I'm not going to read that in detail. The tenant has to acknowledge that brokers are not obligated to disclose certain things. That's fine. That doesn't change, but you need to be aware that it's there, and make sure your tenant does read that because they do have to acknowledge that. But with regard to inspections and investigations, folks, really, really important that you understand that the presentation, investigations or inspections are not done the same way as they are with a purchase. Let me see what pulls up next here. Well, I'll get to that in a minute, but we'll go over this as another point when we get to our lease document itself. But the move-in, move-out form, a lot of agents misinterpret the move-in, move-out form and misinform their tenants that that form is what you fill out to get things all fixed and stuff like that. Let me tell you, if you are showing a property and it is in crappy condition, you need to have a conversation with the landlord's agent before your tenant writes that lease, because most likely, yeah, they're not going to fix it, right? I mean, let's just go from experience. If the property is not in great condition, that is kind of an indicator of how that landlord maintains that property. Now, the exclusion here is when the landlord's agent says to you, hey, you can go see it, but we have not gotten the cleaning crews in there. We have a whole repair team, totally different scenario, right? That's why the conversation has to be between you and the landlord's representative, because if you know they've got cleaning crews coming in, you know they've got people coming in to maybe paint or do some touch-up work and fix things, that's a different scenario. But if the home has been on the market for 45 days and it still looks like crap, I'm going to make a bet with you, it's going to look like crap and they're not going to do anything about it. So if your tenant is like, well, they have to fix this, they have to fix it, oh my gosh, this is just awful, they have to do this, you need to have a serious talk with them, because the landlord is probably not going to do anything on that property. You need to check with that landlord's agent and say, hey, look, we're seeing a lot of things that are beyond normal wear and tear. Is the landlord going to fix these prior to the tenant moving in? Right? Because if it doesn't get fixed prior to the tenant moving in, yeah, tenant had better be happy with those things, right? I'm just saying, trying to go backwards and get those things repaired after the tenant has been in there. Guess what your participation in that is? Anybody online want to tell me what your participation in that after the lease is executed and the tenant has moved in? What is your participation?
None.
None.
None. Look at you. Yay. Yay. None. Your job is over. You're not doing property management. You don't work for the landlord. You don't work for the tenant anymore. You're gone, right? So you have to do that stuff in advance. And again, if a property's been on the market for 45 days, they're not doing anything on it. Because if they wanted to do anything, they would have done it beforehand, because they would have wanted to present their best foot forward. And quite honestly, we all know there are landlords that don't care about the property. So, but here we go. Language we've seen over and over from the lawsuit settlement and in this lovely document, right? Broker compensation is not set by law nor by any board, association of realtors, multiple listing service, or in any other manner than is fully negotiated between broker and tenant in this agreement. All right. So very similar. We've seen that over and over, and important for us to recognize. Now, here are a couple really key points. I just have to move my little, you guys may or may not be able to see my face on this, so it gets in my way because we only have one screen here. So, retainer fee. Now, it's really important you see, and I'll highlight this in just a second, but check if applicable, right? The first box says, tenant agrees to pay broker a non-refundable retainer fee in the amount of blank dollars within 5 days or blank days of execution of this agreement. And, this is again how you want to do business. Personally, I'm not giving the tenant 5 days. They want to hire me and I'm going to start working. I need to get that check, because that check has to go to Realty One Group, right? It's not written to me, it's written to the company, okay? Which is earned when paid, right? So it's earned immediately. When you start working, they're paying you, right? That's the idea, for the initial consultation, research, and other services. Or tenant agrees to pay broker blank dollars for each showing up to a maximum of X dollars, right? Which is earned and due at time of service, right? So you have two ways to approach this. This is totally up to you on your model. Do you want to say, look, I'm going to charge you an upfront retainer fee of, I don't know, $500, right? Pick your choice. I'm just making a random number here. This is not any suggestion. I'm just saying random number here. XYZ pineapples. How about that? It's a specific dollar amount for your services to get started. Okay. It's an initial consultation. Or you can say, look, I'm going to show you up to 10 properties. And it's going to be done at, I don't know, $50 a property, right? So you could do that. And then they're supposed to pay you as you go through these showings, which is kind of peculiar, but they're going to pay you. And again, who does that check get written to? Realty One Group, right? So you're gonna have to bring those little checks into us. Maybe that you go out for a day and say, okay, we have 10 properties lined up, or we have 5 today, 5 tomorrow. I'll take a check from you for whatever the calculation is, and I'll take that in. Right now, important, is this fee being credited or not credited against the buyer broker compensation below, right? So it's really important that you understand that up here, the boxes, they're click boxes, right? Either a flat retainer amount or a per showing retainer fee with a possibility of a maximum fee, all right? So you could have, I'm going to show each property and I'm going to charge $10 a property, like whatever. I mean, it's going to depend, right? Think about it. If you're showing properties all the way from Maricopa to Surprise, I don't know about you, but gas is a little expensive today.
Mhm.
So you might want to have something that's going to cover that distance. That's a long way to drive, right? And that's a lot of gas. So you need to think about that before you do this with somebody. Where are they looking? How much time is involved? And by the way, you might want to pre-qualify them first, find out actually, what they make. Are they looking in the right price point? Do they have any felonies? Because do they have any dogs that are restricted dogs? Because gosh, you can look at a lot of properties that then they are not going to qualify for because of these other things. All right, so let's look at the next thing here. I checked these boxes. So again, you could kind of see that the top box is the flat retainer. The second box is the purse showing retainer. You're going to pick one of those boxes. You cannot pick both. Okay. Oh my gosh, does not this look so familiar, right? Our forms committee worked very hard to make things very similar form by form so things had consistency. Again, I've been doing this 27 years. We have never in 27 years had 18 forms. Well, 13 of them were modified, 5 new forms, right? So that's a lot of revisions, and they did that so they could create that continuity. So here we have something that looks exactly like our buyer broker exclusive employment agreement, right? Check only one box, right? So either you're going to check a percentage, a dollar amount, or other. You would be surprised at how many of these I have seen that have line 29 and then line 31 checked, because they say a percentage and then they say other, or what they're going to pay, what the landlord's going to pay me. Last time I checked, the words check only one means you can only check one of those boxes. So what happens on a contract when the parties have agreed and basically violated the contract? What happens to the contract? It's voidable, right? And if you go to court, who is the one that's supposed to know this contract?
You.
The agent is, right? You're held to the higher standard, not your tenant. So if you filled out this contract wrong, I'm not sure a court's going to look very highly upon you, right? So keep that in mind. If it says check only one box, please only check one box. But here is the most important part of this whole lease. I'm sorry, tenant broker exclusive employment agreement. Remember, we said this is not a part of the NAR settlement. So guess what they have in here? Lines 32 through 34. We used to see this, and now it's still here on the tenant side, or the compensation broker receives from the landlord or landlord's broker, whichever is greater. You already have what you are trying to mess up on lines 29 through 31 right there on 32 through 34. So you know what? Please read your documents. It's right there. You can put in that you're going to receive 500 pineapples, right? And then if the landlord is giving 750, guess what? You get the 750. Yay! Right? You didn't have to do anything. You just have to read the documents, right? So in either event, tenant authorizes broker to accept compensation from landlord or landlord's broker, which shall be credited against any compensation owed by tenant to broker pursuant to this agreement, right? So if the landlord is paying 300 and you had 500, well, then your tenant has to pay the remainder, okay? But if in fact it is some other direction there and it's more from the landlord, then you get the higher amount and your tenant doesn't pay you anything. And then the question is, if the retainer fee was to be credited against that, does the retainer fee get returned or not? And that actually, I don't have an answer to that, but I will look into that. Broker compensation should be paid at the time of occupancy or otherwise agreed upon in writing. And that is usually, I think, actually, we'll check if it's in the lease. Okay. So, or from landlord or landlord's broker, again, whichever is greater. So please stop using the buyer broker agreement. When you're taking a tenant out and you use the buyer broker agreement and use these lines. I don't know, they're number 29 and 31. That's where I'm seeing it. Somebody grabs the buyer broker agreement for a tenant, fills in line 1 saying a certain percentage, and then, or fills in the next line with a dollar amount, then fills in the next one, or whatever the landlord says. The buyer broker agreement doesn't even apply, first of all. And second of all, you voided part of it because you filled in more than one line. And if you'd used the right agreement, you're already covered. So please know there is a tenant broker exclusive employment agreement. That's what we're looking at right now. And you get that lovely thing still in there, which we used to have, right? Because this is not a part of the NAR settlement. It's unrelated to the settlement. All right, so let's move on. Tenant agrees to pay the broker compensation within X calendar days, right? Blank line calendar days after expiration date. Tenant enters into an agreement to lease any property shown to tenant or negotiated by broker on behalf of tenant during the term of this agreement. So if you've shown 10 properties to the tenant, and behind your back, they go over to the landlord and start talking to the landlord directly, guess what? They still owe you that buyer broker stuff, right? Now, obviously, if you're negotiating it, you're going to be involved in this. But if you aren't, this works just like the buyer broker agreement, and you have a contract with the tenant and they're obligated to pay you. Now, I will tell you, we are seeing more retainers being done on rentals now, up front, to try to go ahead of this, because I think most of us, pursuing somebody over, I don't know, $300 is not going to be worth it. It's just pretty hard. There are additional terms and conditions. Right now, I'm not sure of what you might write in there, but if there's something you're looking at writing in there, please call me beforehand, because I will assure you it will come across my desk. If you guys have not noticed, and I had somebody absolutely panic, they're like, my file's been flagged. Like, yes, anytime you write in your contract something on additional terms and conditions, I get to read it. The compliance people do not accept any of those. They're automatically flagged for what's called broker review. So I get to read it. So if you're questioning it beforehand and are thinking, oh, I'll just put it down there, it'll just get passed through, Melissa will never see it. Yes, I will. Because our compliance people do not read those. I mean, they read them, but they will not comment on them. They immediately flag it. I'm not even sure they waste their time reading a paragraph because they know they can't answer it. Even if they wanted to, they cannot bypass coming to the broker for the review. So save yourself time and energy. Text me and say, hey, thinking about putting this blah, blah, blah sentence into my tenant broker agreement. Is that okay? That's a really quick answer, folks. I can get back to you really quickly, right? So please send that to me. Send me what you want to write in there. Like, it's not a big deal. I'll be happy to look at that. Okay. I'm not going to read the equal housing opportunity. I am hoping that all of you understand that the equal housing is absolutely critical. It's critical in our buyer broker, but it's even more critical probably in the rental process. And we certainly do see probably more fair housing violations in the rental process because landlords think that they're above the law for some reason. And they think, I don't want that person renting my space. There's all sorts of things that they may want to do. It's your job to make sure that they are, following fair housing. And yes, you can pull the fair housing advisory. Other potential tenants. Gosh, folks, Realty One Group has 3,000 agents right now in the Maricopa County area. So you do need to explain to the tenant, they have to consent and acknowledge that other potential tenants represented by Realty One Group, right? The broker, let alone by you. And yes, I have had agents call me and go, oh my God, I just got a call from another person wanting to see the same home I just saw, whether it's for rent or for sale, doesn't really matter. Yes, you can do that. And yes, you're allowed to do that. You have to be very careful. You can't disclose any confidentiality if each party is going after the same property, but you can, and certainly the brokerage may consider make an offer on or lease the same or similar properties as the tenant is seeking. Very, very possible to have happen. They're just, rentals sometimes are hard to come by depending on what they're looking for. Okay. I'm going to leave this up for a second. You can take a peek at this while I have some coffee. I am not reading all of this. This language is very similar to everything you've seen in your buyer broker employment agreement. This is not any different, whether the fact that it's a tenant versus a buyer. We immediately go to mediation if there's a dispute between you and your client, okay? Attorney fees, usually the prevailing party is awarded their reasonable attorney fees and arbitration costs. Arizona law, this agreement's governed by Arizona law. Copies and counterparts, hopefully you all understand how copies and counterparts work at this point. And this is the entire agreement. Any addenda and attachments constitute the entire agreement between the tenant and the broker, right? This is a very small document, okay? If there's addenda and attachments, they supersede any other written or oral agreements between the tenant and the broker and can be modified only in writing signed by tenant and broker. And I'm sorry, the entire agreement supersedes anything previously written, right? If you had something written on a sheet of paper and you then fill this out, this supersedes anything that's written before. That's why the date is so important to have on these documents. Sometimes you put these things through electronically and don't have the date stamp on there. You need to have that date stamp. It's really, really important. So please think about that as you're moving forward. Really important capacity that the tenant warrants that the tenant A has the legal capacity, full power and authority to enter into this agreement and consummate the transaction contemplated hereby on tenant's own behalf or on behalf of the party the tenant represents as appropriate, right? So who could not be signing this agreement? Anybody know? How old do you have to be to write a contract in the state of Arizona?
18.
18,
18.
right? You cannot have a 17-year-old sign this, right? So kind of important that they can't do that. So you do have to look at those things. Pretty rare that you're going to come across that, but you do need to know that. Now, how would you find that out? You could ask them, but guess what? You almost invariably need for any tenant for application. You need a driver's license, right? So one of the things that, and you can blame this on your broker if you'd like to, but one of the things I've done for 27 years, because you often are meeting tenants, not necessarily in the office first, although I highly recommend that. If you are at any point going and meeting somebody without meeting them at the office first, one of the things that I put into a place, I want to say 15 years ago, goodness, is that they had to text me their driver's license, any of the parties that were going to be on the lease, their driver's license, before I schedule any appointments for them, period. Because I need it anyway for the application. And the reality is then you know who you're meeting. And funny thing, if you've been talking to somebody who said their name is Sarah the whole time and all of a sudden you find out it's Michelle, it's kind of odd, right? So, and usually, honestly, you start asking for driver's licenses and all of a sudden they ghost you. Gee, too bad. I'm not wasting my time on that, right? So, I think it's important to know that. You can do that however you want, but I do recommend, just like with your buyer brokers, with your buyer brokers protocols, set up a standard operating procedure for you and your business with tenants. I suggest you write it out, right? So what are you doing before you get this tenant broker signed, right? What are you doing to qualify that tenant to be somebody that you're going to take and look at property, right? You want to know what their income is, because I love it when people tell me, oh yeah, I make $100,000 a year. Really? Then why are you renting an $1,800 house? Wait a minute, that is not making sense, right? So you need to find out what they make. Now, are you going to ask for the W-2s? Sure, you can. That may be part of what you ask for in advance, right? Because you need to verify that. What's the rule of thumb that most landlords use when they're looking at whether their income is enough?
3 to 4 times the amount of growth.
It's 3 times. It's 3 times the rent
Okay.
is the monthly gross, not the net, the gross, right? Now, you said 3 to 4.
Yeah. I
Gosh,
thought only 4.
well, that's kind of crazy
It
because,
is. It is.
so think about this, folks. In the last 3 years, with the amount of housing prices going up and the amount of rental prices going up, did our income go up comparably, right?
No.
Comparably?
No.
No. So I actually got to the point with a landlord that's I helped for, I don't know, 7 years. And I said, look, you need to be careful because if you continue to ask for the 3 times the rent, you need to understand the people that were renting in this neighborhood no longer qualify for this neighborhood, right? And a pretty simple calculations you can do with your landlords to do that. But as a tenant, if you're helping the tenant, you need to tell them that most people do look at 3 times the rent, right? And so if you've got somebody that is looking at 2,000 a month in rent, they better be making 6 grand a month in gross. And if they don't know how to figure that out, you know what? Send me your last 2 pay stubs and I'll help to show you where that is on your pay stubs. Let's get on a Zoom call. Let me take a look at your Zoom. You show me your pay stubs and I'll be able to show this to you. This is not on your net. This is on your gross. And they need to know that. But here's the thing. If they aren't making 6 grand, why are you spinning your wheels looking at properties and trying to set appointments for properties that they're not going to be able to get into? And some of them, if they're property managers, you send over that application, they pay their $50 and they're being denied and they wasted $50. Who's responsible for that? To me, that's you. Why would you set them up to spend 50 or 60, $70 a person for something they don't qualify for? So, and again, this is your value. You're explaining to people you're not going to waste their time. You're going to make sure that they are as qualified as possible before they start looking at rentals. Now, are there some people that are going to object to that? Sure. Sure they are. Do you want to work with them? Do you want to spend your time and energy with them? I would say no. I wouldn't be spending all that time. All right, let's move on. Bottom of this is the acceptance tenant signature. I am seeing more and more. Why are you not getting them to fill this out? Why do you not want to know where they're currently living and, that information there, so that you know exactly where they are? Your firm name and address is down here, but 69 and 70 over and over and over is being left blank. It's being left blank on the buyer ones. Why? Nobody else is getting this. This is for your records. Why would you not want some verification of where they're living? Okay. All right. Notice to tentative new management. This is the other document. Notice to tentative new management, property manager, landlord, tenant. We will manage the lease effective of blank days. After this date, notices, payments of any kind, repair requests must be delivered to the new property manager. And here, all future payments, rent due, new property manager. It's just a very simple form to clearly explain to the tenant who is going to be managing, where dollars go, etc. Highly unlikely that you are going to have anything to do with this document. But in the odd case that you are working with a landlord and they ask you to send this out instead of their property manager, which would be very weird, you can do it. It is an AAR form. You are not the property manager. It clearly states that, but this form exists. Do not send it over to your client to do on their own. Their property manager should be doing that. Revised rental leasing forms. There were red line changes on the property management agreement and on the ready form. Right, here we go, property management agreement. These are the parties, the owner, and then the broker. Guess what form that you will never be doing if you are with Realty One Group? This one, because we do not operate and manage properties. So you will never touch this document as long as you're working for Realty One Group. Working for somebody else, you can go use that form. I'm not going to go over it. Ready form, we already know this one well. Make sure the broker name and the licensee, your name is there. We obviously know the disclosure, right? Buyer broker, seller broker, buyer or tenant. So the top section there, right? Buyer broker is also tenant broker on the top there. And then comes the broker representing both buyer and seller. Limited representation. Which came first? I can't back up, but which came first? The buyer and the seller broker, those categories came first. Before you get the limited representation, you will always have the individual representation. And remember that in just a moment. Look, same thing we've had this on the ready form before, pursuant to ARS 322156. Sellers, lessors, and brokers are not obligated to disclose the property is or has been cited natural death, We just saw that on the other document as well. So the duties of the broker in a real estate transaction do not relieve the seller or buyer, or I would say, or tenant from the responsibility to protect their own interests, right? The seller and the buyer/tenant should carefully read all the agreements to ensure the documents adequately express their understanding of the transaction. Funny thing that is in bold lettering, right? And if you are not having this conversation with the tenant or your buyer or your seller, please take a minute on this document and make sure they know that, right? And how many of you are missing the initials on line 45 that the agency election does not establish broker compensation, right? This is that big new paragraph. Got to get that initial, folks. Otherwise it comes back to you. All right. Oh, this was not supposed to be there. Okay. So buyer and tenant election. Here we go. I still get these wrong, or I've sent to me wrong, right? Buyer or tenant elects. Can somebody tell me which of these boxes should be checked if you represent the tenant?
48 and 50. Oh, and 60 buyer.
Well, yes, on 60 buyer should be checked. That's visible below. Sorry. 48 and 50 if you represent the tenant. Okay. If you are representing the landlord and a tenant comes to see the property, what boxes get checked then?
49.
49.
If you represent the landlord, box 49 gets checked, that the tenant understands you represent the landlord. Unless they ask you to represent them as well and do a dual agency, limited representation, right? So then if you are representing the landlord initially and the tenant asks you to represent them as well, which boxes get checked? Obviously, it
60?
got quiet there.
I'm like,
All three?
60?
60.
All three?
No, no. So it's really important. What did I say occurs first?
So
Buyer
you're
or
representing, we start with you're representing the owner. And then someone comes in and they want you to represent them as well. So you're representing both parties.
Okay, so let's just back up. On the document itself, what is the first two paragraphs, not here, but above? What do the first two paragraphs show you? Let's see if I can go backwards. I don't know that I can go backwards. Let's see. Okay. What is first here? Buyer and seller. Okay. So you guys are all correct. If you already have a relationship with a landlord, yes, that exists. But the minute somebody says, I want you to represent me, you have to start with one of these two paragraphs. And if you're talking to that tenant and they're saying, I want you to represent me, and your landlord has said you can do that, then you have to start with one of these two paragraphs first, right? And in that scenario, you then are saying, all right, tenant, 7 through 13 applies to you first and foremost. Okay? Then we go down to this section, right? And we talk about limited representation with the tenant. In that conversation, you're explaining to the tenant how it works with limited representation to make sure that that is truly what they want. Because until you get to that limited representation part, you've had to move hats, right? We're going to put the landlord hat down and put on a tenant hat and go, okay, let me explain to you. If I'm representing you on this tenancy, you need to understand that first paragraph was there, but now we need to talk about 19 through 27. And they have to then agree that they want you to move forward. So when we get to this section and start checking these boxes, we're checking them with that tenant hat on, right? And the tenant election is that they want you to represent them as the tenant, as tenant's broker. I know it says buyer, but just to follow what we're doing here, line 48 and line 50. Show buyer properties listed with the firm, and they agree that the broker can act as both the buyer for both buyer and seller, right? Or landlord and tenant, right? And that they will fill out the informed consent should be acknowledged in separate writing other than the purchase contract, right? Well, that's in the purchase. But I think we still do the limited representation. That's very odd. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
At no point can you check all three of those boxes because the buyer cannot say you're representing them and the seller on 48 and 49. It's 48 and 50. 50 is acknowledging that you or someone from Realty One Group is representing the landlord in this case, right? So you never check all three boxes because
So
again,
50 covers.
that's what
So
50 covers,
50
right?
covers. Got it.
And, but more important, I want to make sure you understand that when you begin to look at the agency form, the ready form itself, to begin with, you either have the hat, and I'm going to use buyer or seller here. Either you have the buyer hat on when you're first talking to that person, right? If they are saying, I want you to represent me, you either have the hat on as the buyer's agent or the seller's agent, tenant or landlord, right? You can only have one hat on when you start and you go over those first two paragraphs. When in fact, if you absolutely represent the landlord or the seller at the same time, we recognize that that's why 50 has to be checked. And by the way, for those of you that aren't checking 50 before you're taking clients out, I hope you realize if you do not check 50 when you do this document, you cannot show Realty One Group listings, right? You understand that. Because if they have not granted you the right to do the limited representation, you can't show those properties. And likewise, if you are being on the seller side, here I'm checking these boxes, right? The bottom one showing, obviously, if you are not representing the tenant, you're explaining this form and you are telling them clearly, I am not representing you, period. I represent the seller. That then is that box 49 is being checked. But let's say if you're representing the seller, and again, if the seller says, no, I don't want you to do limited representation, I'm paying you to focus your energy on me, then guess what? You need to put in office remarks. Realty One Group agents cannot show this property. And if you get a call from a Realty One Group agent, you need to say, look, they've instructed me that they do not want limited representation. So if your buyer really wants this, you may need to pass it off to somebody else because they've said it cannot be limited representation. right? Does everybody understand? And we do have an agent that just dealt with this, and he did his due diligence, went through, looked up how many homes in the area had sold recently with Realty One Group agents, and found a quarter of the homes that sold with Realty One Group, and explained that to the seller. Okay. Right? So you need to understand this form is nuanced, but you've got to know how to explain that to your clients. All right. Residential lease agreement. There is no way I'm getting into this because the hour is almost up. I do have the entire thing. What you need to know is that the only change on this document that got added, see the little red line on the very bottom there that says seller compensation? That is the only change that actually occurred to this document. So it was originally done in November of 2023. Of course, the new one now says August of 2024. And whoops. The top of that obviously has check boxes, and you'll see the note, the tenant advisory. If you represent the landlord, and you are sending over the lease to be completed, you know, this does have the tenant advisory at aaronline.com. Please understand the public can access parts of the Arizona Association of Realtors website at aaronline.com. They cannot see everything, but they can see some of the sample forms, and they certainly can see the tenant and buyer advisories. Those are available to the general public. Okay, that's why it says that on there. All right. I'm not going to be able to go over all of this. I had some really fun things. I don't know that I can. Let's see if I take this out of the slide deck. I'm going to flip to something at the very end here. And we'll have to do this another time, but I'm going to go to a few questions here, see whether you guys can answer these. These are the grade 8. This is actually from AAR Online. 8 questions. Can you correctly answer 8 true or false questions about the recent practice changes? MLS participants must ensure that when working with a buyer, a written exclusive buyer-broker representation agreement between the buyer and buyer's broker is entered into before a buyer tours residential real property. Is that true or false? Anybody online?
True.
Anybody else? There's a key tricky word in there.
Can't you also have just the right to show, not like just the selling, but the showing?
So not the exclusive, but the right to show property? Yes, ma'am, you can. You had that correct. There's a new form called Buyer Broker Agreement to Show Property. This agreement satisfies the practice change mandated by the lawsuit, but it's non-exclusive. So the trick word there was a written exclusive buyer broker representation. That is not required. Just some type of representation. So there are 2 different forms. Again, that's for buying, but number 2, buyer broker representation agreements. Notice that exclusive was removed from there. Buyer broker representation agreements must include a statement that MLS participants may not receive compensation that exceeds the amount or rate agreed upon with the buyer from any source. True or false?
True.
True. True, 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 true. Buyer broker cannot receive compensation from any source in the transaction that exceeds the rate or amount set forth in the buyer broker representation agreement, and this must be expressed in the agreement. The AAR forms meet this requirement. Please do not fill out more than one of the 3 lines. We saw them earlier. And on that other line, do not write or whatever this or more than that or blah, blah, blah. No, it has to be an actual number, a clear, identifiable amount. Okay, number 3. In stating the rate of compensation on the buyer broker representation agreement, the parties may agree to write in, quote, buyer broker compensation shall be whatever amount the seller is offering by way of a co-broke, unquote. True or false?
False.
That should be a resounding false, right? Must be objectively ascertainable and may not be open-ended. We all know that one. Listing agents sitting their open house must have each prospective buyer that enters the home sign a buyer broker representation agreement. True or false?
False.
False.
And a listing agent sitting somebody else's buyer somebody else's open house, are they required to have a prospective buyer sign a buyer broker agreement?
False.
False. False. A listing agent or their representative, so another agent from the same brokerage holding an open house, is not acting on the potential buyer's behalf. They're acting on behalf of the seller. Therefore, the rule does not apply unless the listing agent later begins working with the buyer, right? So if the buyer then says, hey, I'd like you to show me homes, then you need that buyer broker employment agreement. All right. These are kind of fun though. Brokerage may use MLS data through a feed or export to identify on their website the amount of cooperating compensation other brokerages are offering in conjunction with their listings. True or false?
False.
False.
Got falses and some trues here. It is false. The NAR settlement prohibits the use of MLS data or data feeds to directly or indirectly establish or maintain a platform, I would say any platform of offers of compensation from multiple brokers or other buyer representatives. Can you post what you are offering on your listing on your website if it's your listing?
Yeah.
Yes. Can you put
Mine
flyer
does.
out there? Huh?
Remember, Melissa, mine did on mine, and I panicked. I freaked out. I was like, it's showing compensation. But yeah, on yours it does, not on the others.
Yes, you can display yours. You can't display something from HomeSmart, right? You can't display something from somebody else, right? But you can put your information out there. Okay. All right. The Realtors Code of Ethics, Standard of Practice 16-16, prohibits the negotiation of buyer broker compensation in a buyer's purchase offer. True or false?
Cannot.
False.
Oh, no, it's true.
False.
Prohibits.
Prohibits the negotiation of buyer broker compensation in a buyer's purchase offer.
False. Isn't it only if it impedes negotiation?
So this is saying it prohibits the negotiation, and you're saying, let's see, it's false, right?
It's part of the
Folks, we're
negotiation.
negotiating contracts all the time now, right?
Yeah.
So a buyer can ask their buyer broker to make it a term of their offer that the seller, not seller's broker, seller pay certain compensation to buyer broker. What is the SCA? The seller compensation addendum. It is specifically, the buyer is specifically asking the seller to pay their buyer broker compensation. They are putting it in there, and yes, it is false. That is not what the Standard of Practice 16-16 says, okay? Because the buyer has the right to ask for that. Disputes about offer of compensation between brokers can still be mediated and arbitrated by a realtor association. True or false? True or false?
True.
True. Okay. As always has been the case, realtor associations can mediate and arbitrate commissions disputes between its members. Pursuant to the Zitzer-Burnett settlement, NAR agreed to put in place a new rule prohibiting offers of compensation in the MLS. True or false?
True.
Sure, this is true. By way of the settlement agreement, NAR agreed to prohibit offers of compensation in the MLS between listing brokers and sellers to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives. And I think that was my last one. Woo! Got through all of those. Any questions for you guys? I will stay on and try to answer those. Let me get out of here.
I do have one question.
Yep.
I have, can a property manager send to the tenant? Property manager is the representing the.
I have a quick question.
Hold on one second. I've got one here. I'll repeat in just a second.
Yeah. So
Okay.
can property manager send the lease without me looking at the lease? to the tenant.
So the question is, can the property manager send the lease to the tenant directly without including you? Oh, sadly, they do it all the time.
They try.
Should they do it all the time? Should they do it? No. Can they do it? Unfortunately, yes. And part of the reason for that is oftentimes they actually consider themselves the only one on the contract. So you need to be communicating with the landlord.
I phone called her right away. And
Right.
I got into it.
Right.
I said, I want to see it first. And she added another line on the bottom of it.
What'd she add on the bottom
She
of it?
added something stupid. Oh, the cars have to be parked inside the garage or something like that. And she didn't even send me the addendum 1. But
Yeah.
she was going to send him the addendum 1. I said, no, I want to see it first.
So again, unfortunately, this is gonna be, you have to be kind of a bulldog as a leasing agent representing the tenant, because you're just gonna have to be really, really on top of it and on top of them. So one of the things that can happen is if you watch the way they do it, some of them will say, you're referring them to us, that you are actually
Yeah.
not going to represent them. And that, I know Ami dealt with that.
That-
So
yeah.
you
So
just have to watch.
I advise my clients, as soon as we start into the offer, I always tell them, even with new builds, any communication, please forward to me. I might not be included. And
Correct.
yet you're right. It ended up being a referral because they consider themselves the agent. So that one threw me off.
Right. No, and that does happen, right? So what will happen is they will end up not putting your name at the back of the lease. It will just be their offices, and they want you to send in, and then you are no longer representing the tenant. You just have to go out and really talk to them. I think, Ami, your idea is absolutely spot on.
Yeah.
Make sure your tenant understands that if they get something and you have not called them to say, hey, something arrived, that they need to make sure you get a copy of it. But you also need to preface it beforehand, talking to the landlord agent and saying, look, I am representing this tenant and I do need to see this paperwork. I need to see it prior to them viewing it. Please send it to me. I will spend the time putting the signature blocks on, etc. I know you have their email address because it's part of the application, right? That's the problem. They have all the contact information now. And a lot of agents are pretty lazy. They don't want to be involved and do that. So that's the problem.
She immediately went to, well, I don't trust you in getting the paperwork and sending it to the tenant. I said, what am I going to do to the paperwork?
So the comment is the other agent, the landlord's agent, said she didn't trust our agent from getting the paperwork to the tenant, probably in a timely manner or done correctly. Now, I will say there are a lot of little initials and things, so it very easily you could miss something if you're not familiar with what they have.
Yeah.
If
But we
we've
can
got
still review it. I mean, we can still get it forwarded to review.
Well,
Yeah,
and you can say, look, just send it through for me to review before it goes to them. If they put you down as a reviewer versus a CC, but you do need to know, you need to then open it and look at it because it won't
Yeah.
go to your tenant until you have looked at it.
Oh, yeah.
And I think some of the problem, and I agree with property managers, some landlords, they check out, or some tenant agents check out.
Oh,
Once they've got the place done, they're like, I'm only making $200. I'm out of here, right? So you need to be on top of it to tell them, I understand what you've been dealing with. That is not me. I'd like to show my value. I want my tenant covered, and they have asked me to look for certain things, and that's what I'm going to do. But that is a challenge.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I had a quick question.
Yes. Oh my God.
You
Okay. For those that don't know, the person that asks questions on rentals is Jacqueline Busco. Yes, ma'am. What can I answer for you?
you had mentioned earlier that the leasing kind of territory was not involved with the lawsuit. So are we actually required to do these tenant brokerage agreements?
Yes.
Okay.
Because you do still have to explain how you're getting paid, but the tenant broker addendum clearly defines that you can get paid on that other amount. And that's, I mean, you've got the option there that it can be whatever's coming from the landlord if you want that to be the case. Because again, whichever is greater. So on this form and only this form, you could put 0 on one of those lines above. You could put on the other box whatever landlord's paying, right? Because down below it says or whatever landlord's paying. So that's totally fine. But the problem is that you really don't have any other way to get compensation. So if this form is not there, I'm not sure your compensation is covered.
Even with, if we included the seller compensation addendum in the lease, then,
Well, but the seller compensation addendum goes back to the
form.
agreement, right?
Okay.
And so you have to have the agreement, which clearly says you can get either or, and you want that coverage.
okay, just check it. I've been using it. I'm just wondering, when you said that, it triggered something. So I'm like,
Yeah.
oh, interesting.
No, and they had to change all the forms, but the SCA refers back to this form. So if you don't have this form, because the
That's
SCA
true.
says, a maximum of what's on this form.
Okay, thank you.
And we got to get you lined up to teach us that awesome water, deed, and fire class, please.
Yeah, I'm teaching in Glendale tomorrow and there's 70 people coming. So I know there's a lot that want to come.
Well, I need to get the hotel next door because that's the only way it's going to work to have you come here, because we'll have a ton of people to attend as well. So,
Yeah.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
Other questions? Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time, and at some point I'll go over the lease itself. Maybe Jackie will come do the lease with me and we'll have a fun in-person type thing with both of us, because she knows these leases back and forth, and boy, can share the headache of what does and does not work, right, Jackie?
Thank you, Melissa.
All right, guys, have a good one. You guys stay safe and enjoy. Hey, come join us today. We have we brought back our wine to the broker. We'll have some appetizers and some wine and some sparkling seltzer waters and some sweet treats. So come join us. Begins at 4 o'clock this afternoon in our office. Love to see all of you. It's great to see so many people on here. Thank you much and have a good one. Bye-bye.